Give the ring back. The words landed before the door had finished closing behind him, before the candle on the writing table had recovered from the draft, before she had lifted her eyes from the page she had been pretending to read for the last quarter hour. He was standing 3 steps inside the room, gloves still on, coat still buttoned to the throat, and he had not removed his hat. That last detail was what told her how serious he intended to be. A man who did not remove his hat in a lady's sitting room was a man who wished the visit to be brief, or a man who was afraid that if he stayed longer than the errand required, he would not manage the errand at all. She did not yet know which of those two he was, and she suspected he did not know either. "Give the ring back," he said again, more quietly, as if he had heard how the first attempt had sounded and disliked it. The second attempt was worse in a different way. The first had been an order. The second was almost a request, and requests could be refused, and refusals could be argued with, and arguments could go places neither of them had prepared for. She marked the difference and set it aside for later, the way she had learned to set most things aside for later, in a small drawer at the back of her mind, where she kept every piece of information she had not yet decided how to use. She closed the book without looking at it. She had been on page 142 of a treatise on inheritance law that she was not supposed to be reading, and she had been on that page for 11 minutes, and she had folded down the corner 3 pages back so that she could find her way home later. If there was a later, if this room was still a room she was allowed to sit in by the end of the afternoon. She stood. She was smaller than he was by nearly a head, and thinner than she had been a year ago, and dressed in the dove gray he had once told her, on the only evening they had ever spoken honestly, made her look like a person who had already decided something and was waiting to be asked what. She was not, at this moment, waiting to be asked anything. She was waiting to see whether he had come here as her husband, as her enemy, or as the third and stranger thing she had begun to suspect he might be, which was a man who did not yet know he had come here as a supplicant. "Certainly," she said. Her voice did not shake. She had rehearsed the not shaking for 6 days, in mirrors, in gardens, in the small chapel at the end of the east corridor where no one went between the hours of 2 and 4, and the rehearsal had held. She reached up to the chain at her throat. The ring had lived there since the morning after the ceremony, worn beneath the lace, warmed by the pulse under her collarbone, hidden from the eyes of servants and cousins, and the mother-in-law who counted objects the way other women counted blessings. She unclasped the chain. She slid the ring off it. She placed it, without ceremony, in the flat of her palm. It was heavier than a ring that size had any right to be. She had noticed this on the first day and had not stopped noticing it. There was, she believed, a reason for the weight that had nothing to do with gold, and everything to do with what had been done to the ring before it had ever been given to her, and everything to do with a small set of scratches on the inner band that were not decorative and were not accidental, and were not, when read in the right light, ornamental at all. She held out her hand. She did not walk toward him. Let him cross the room, she thought. Let him take the 3 steps that turn a command into a transaction. If he could not do that, then he had not really come to take it back. He had come to see whether she would give it, and that was a different visit, and she would greet it differently. He crossed the room. He took the 3 steps. He removed one glove, finger by finger, without hurry, the way a man removes a glove when he wishes to be seen removing it, and he reached for the ring. His hand was steady. She watched it be steady. She had expected it to be steady, because he was famously that, steady at cards, steady on horseback, steady in the house when other men lost their tempers over grain prices and colonial debts. It was said of him, in the drawing rooms she had begun to be invited to only after her marriage, that he had never once raised his voice and had also never once needed to. Steadiness was the currency he had been minted in. His fingers closed on the ring. She let it go. There was a moment, quite short, in which the ring was neither in her palm nor entirely in his, but resting across both, like a coin at the edge of a table deciding which side it belonged to. Then he lifted it clear. Then his hand began to shake. It was not a large shake. It was not the tremor of a man in a fever or a man who has just been struck. It was the very small, very specific shake of a man whose body has understood something a full second before his mind has agreed to understand it, and is trying to signal the news upward through the arm before the news becomes an announcement in the throat. His thumb moved once against the band. His forefinger corrected. The ring turned a quarter turn in his grip, and then a half turn, and then he closed his fist over it, tight, the way a person closes a fist over a splinter they have just noticed, and the shaking stopped because the fist would not permit it. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at his hand again. She had 5 seconds, perhaps 6, before he would decide what expression to wear, and she used all of them. He said, very evenly, "Thank you." He said it the way one thanks a footman who has brought the correct tray. He turned. He walked to the door. He did not put the ring in his pocket. He carried it in the closed fist, as if putting it in a pocket would be a kind of trust he was not prepared to extend, not to the pocket, not to himself, not yet. At the threshold he paused. He did not look back. He said, "We will speak at supper." Then he was gone, and the candle on the writing table, which had recovered from the first draft, was troubled again by the second. She sat down. She placed both hands flat on the closed book. She counted, silently, to 20, because 20 was the number she had chosen years ago for moments in which the wrong reaction would cost her too much, and the right reaction had not yet arrived. At 15, she understood that her own hands were now shaking, very slightly, in the same way his had. At 20, she understood why. He had felt the scratches. That was the only possible reading. He had felt them under the pad of his thumb in the instant the ring had turned in his grip, and the scratches had told him something that the ring, worn on a chain under lace for 11 months, had been keeping from him for 11 months, and now the thing that had been kept was out. And it was walking down the corridor in his closed fist, and it would sit at supper with them both. She rose. She crossed to the writing desk. She opened the second drawer from the top, the one whose lock she had learned to pick with a hairpin in the 3rd week of her marriage, not because she wished to steal from herself, but because she wished to know that if the drawer were ever opened by someone else, she would know how, and how fast, and by what tool. Inside the drawer, beneath a stack of unanswered letters from cousins she did not intend to answer, lay a small square of paper folded 4 times. She took it out. She unfolded it. She read, for the 11th time in 6 days, the 3 lines written on it in a hand that was not hers, and not his, and not, so far as she had been able to determine, anyone else's currently living in the house. She refolded the paper. She placed it in the sleeve of her gown, against the inside of her wrist, where the pulse would remind her, all afternoon, that it was there. Then she went to the window, and she looked out over the long lawn to the row of lime trees at the edge of the park, and she did what she had been trained since childhood not to do, which was to permit herself, for the length of one breath, to hope. She had married him for a reason, and it had not been the reason the county believed, and it had not been the reason her uncle believed, and it had not been the reason he himself believed. And now, at last, after 11 months of holding her tongue and holding her breath, and holding the ring against her collarbone. The reason was about to become visible to more than one person in the house. She had not expected it to become visible through his hand. She had expected it to become visible through hers. That the ring itself had chosen to speak first, through the medium of his thumb, felt to her, as she stood at the window, less like an accident and more like a small courtesy from the world. The kind of courtesy the world extended, in her experience, only to people who had earned it by waiting a very long time. Downstairs, a door closed. A voice in the hall asked whether the master was at home for callers. The reply came, softly, that the master was not at home for anyone until supper, and would the callers be so kind as to leave their cards. She listened to the little ceremony of the cards being placed on the salver, the small brass sound of the salver settling on the marble table, the retreating footsteps, the returning silence. In another house, on another afternoon, she would have gone to look at the cards. Today, she did not need to. She knew which two names would be on them, and she knew which of the two names would matter by evening, and she knew which of the two men whose names those were had ridden through the night from the north to be here, and she knew, though he did not yet know she knew, why he had come. She turned from the window. She rang, once, for her maid. When the girl arrived, she asked, in the same even voice she had used to say certainly, for the dove gray to be taken away, and the deep green to be brought out, and for her hair to be dressed simply, and for the pearl comb, not the diamond one, and for a fresh pair of gloves, and for the small silver locket that she had not worn since the wedding to be found, and cleaned and laid out on the dressing table. The maid, who was 17 and clever, and had learned in a year to read the household by the color of the mistress's gown, curtsied and went, and did not ask. That was, in this house, the highest form of loyalty available, and she noted it, and she added it to the small drawer at the back of her mind, in the compartment where she kept the names of the people she intended to protect when the day came. She sat at the dressing table. She looked at herself in the glass. She saw a young woman with unremarkable coloring and remarkable stillness, a mouth that had been called too serious by her aunt and too soft by her uncle, and, on one occasion, by the man who was now walking down the east corridor with her ring in his fist, honest. He had used that word once, at the only supper at which they had ever spoken as themselves. He had said of her mouth that it was honest. She had not answered. She had marked the word and set it aside, because at that supper, on that evening, she had not yet decided whether honesty was a thing she could afford in his house. She had, since then, decided. She lifted the silver locket from the dressing table when the maid brought it. She opened it. Inside were not the miniature portraits that a locket of that size was expected to hold. Inside was a fold of paper so thin it was almost transparent, and on the paper, in a hand she knew as well as her own, because it had been her own, once, before she had been taught to write a lady's hand, were 3 lines. They were not the same 3 lines that were folded into her sleeve. They were older. They were the reason for the ring, and the reason for the marriage, and the reason for the 11 months of silence, and the reason her hand had not shaken when she had unclasped the chain, and the reason her hand was shaking, very slightly. Now, she closed the locket. She fastened it at her throat, where the chain had been. She rose, she said, to the maid, that she would take a turn in the long gallery before supper, and that if anyone asked, she was admiring the portraits. The maid curtsied. The mistress went. The long gallery ran the width of the south front and held, in gilded frames, 4 generations of a family into which she had been inserted by contract 11 months ago. She walked its length slowly. She stopped before none of the portraits she was expected to stop before. She stopped before the smallest one, hung in the least favorable light, at the far end near the window that looked toward the stable yard. It was the portrait of a woman not much older than herself, painted, according to the small brass plate beneath it, 41 years ago in a season that had ended badly for the family and had been, ever since, referred to only in the passive voice. The woman in the portrait was wearing a ring. The ring was on her third finger, and it was turned, in the portrait, so that the band showed and the stone did not, which was not the fashion in which a lady was painted, then or now, unless the painter had been instructed. She had noticed this on the second day of her marriage, and had returned to notice it on the 14th, and the 40th, and every 7th day since. And each time she had counted the marks she could see on the band, and each time the count had come to the same number, and the number was 3, and the marks were, when read in the right light, not ornamental. Behind her, at the far end of the gallery, a floorboard spoke. She did not turn. She knew the weight that had made the board speak. She knew the length of the stride that followed, and the pause that came after the third step, and the small, dry cough that came after the pause, which was not a cough of illness, but a cough of announcement, offered by a man who preferred not to startle a woman in a room full of his ancestors. He said, from 6 paces behind her, "You are looking at my great-aunt." "I am," she said. "Do you know her name?" "I do," she said. And she said it, and it was correct, and there was a pause behind her that lasted longer than she had expected, and in the pause she understood that he had not, until that afternoon, been entirely certain how much she knew, and that the pause was the sound of a man revising, very quickly and very quietly, the map he had been carrying of the woman he had married. He came to stand beside her. He did not stand close. He looked at the portrait. He did not look at her. In his right hand, she noticed, without turning her head, he was no longer carrying anything. The ring had gone somewhere between the sitting room and the gallery, and she was prepared to wager a great deal that it had not gone into a pocket, and had not gone into a drawer, and had gone, instead, onto a finger, though not the one custom would prescribe. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "For which of the last 11 months?" He did not answer at once. He was, she understood, adjusting again, because he had come to the gallery prepared to make one apology, and had discovered, in her question, the shape of at least 4. He chose, at length, the one that cost him most, which surprised her. She had expected him to choose the one that cost him least. She revised her map of him, in turn, and added a line she had not previously drawn. "For the first," he said, "for the letter I sent your uncle before I had met you." She inclined her head. She did not speak. He went on, more slowly. "I believed," he said, "that I was buying silence. I believed that a young woman of your particular circumstances would be grateful, and grateful women are quiet women, and I required quiet, at that time, above all other qualities in a wife. I had not considered that a young woman of your particular circumstances might have already learned quiet without needing to be bought into it, and might therefore not be grateful, and might therefore not be quiet in the way I had planned for." She permitted herself, at last, to look at him. He was looking at the portrait still. His profile in the late afternoon light was less composed than she had ever seen it, and it occurred to her that composure, in him, was not a native trait, but a trained one, and that training could be undone, and that she had just watched, in the sitting room and now in this gallery, the beginning of the undoing. She said, "And the ring?" He said, "The ring was my grandmother's." He paused. "It was," he said, "not originally hers. Whose was it?" she said, though she knew. He said the name. It was the name beneath the portrait. He said it as one says a name that has been forbidden in a house for 41 years and has therefore kept its full weight, undiluted by repetition. He said it, and he said, she had it made. She had it made with the marks inside. She had it made because she believed, and I now believe she was correct, that a message worn on a hand every day for the rest of a life could not be lost, and could not be burned, and could not be seized, and could only be read by whoever thought to turn the band inward and hold it to a candle. Have you turned it inward? She said. Have you held it to a candle? I have, he said. This afternoon, in the west study, with the door locked, and one candle, and no witnesses, because I did not, until this afternoon, wish to have witnesses to a thing I had refused for 22 years to look at. And what did you read? She said. He turned to her. He looked at her, at last, and she saw that his eyes were the eyes of a man who had discovered, in the last hour, that the woman he had married for reasons of political convenience had been sent to him not by her uncle, and not by his own calculation, and not by chance, but by an old, patient, quiet arrangement that had begun in this gallery 41 years ago, with a woman turning a ring on her finger so that the band showed and the stone did not. He said, I read your grandmother's hand. She said, yes. He said, I did not know, when I offered for you, that your grandmother had ever been in this house. She said, she was here for one season. She said, she was very young. She said, she was sent home in disgrace, though the disgrace was not hers. He said, I know that now. She said, do you know the rest of it? He said, I know enough of it to understand why you came, and why you accepted, and why you have worn the ring on a chain and not on your hand, and why you have been reading a treatise on inheritance law in the yellow sitting room every afternoon for 6 weeks, and why, when I said give the ring back, you did not argue. He paused. He said, I do not yet know what you intend to do with what you know. That, he said, is what I have come to the gallery to ask. She considered him. She considered the portrait. She considered the weight of the locket at her throat, and the weight of the folded paper against the pulse in her wrist, and the weight of 11 months of silence, and the weight of the small, specific shake she had watched pass through his hand in the sitting room, which was, she understood now, the first honest thing that had passed between them since the day the contract had been signed. She said, I intend to give you a choice. He said, I expected as much. She said, you will not like either half of it. He said, I did not expect to. She said, then we may as well sit down, and she led him, without haste, to the window seat at the far end of the gallery, where the light was failing, and the stable clock could be heard through the glass, striking the quarter before the hour at which the household would begin to dress for supper. She sat. He sat. She turned her face to him. She began, in a low and even voice, with the first of the 3 lines that had been written on the paper in her sleeve, and she watched, with a tenderness she had not known she still possessed, as the great composed lord of the house learned, sentence by sentence, that the marriage he had arranged for the purpose of silence had been, all along, an act of remembrance, arranged by 2 dead women who had loved each other very much and had lost, and had refused, in dying, to accept the loss as final. She spoke for a long time. He did not interrupt. Once, near the middle, he took off his other glove and set it on the cushion between them, and she understood that the glove was a small flag of surrender, and she accepted it without remarking on it. Once, near the end, he reached, without looking, and covered her hand with his, and she felt, under his palm, the ring that he had put on his smallest finger between the sitting room and the gallery, worn with the band inward, the way his great-aunt had worn it in the portrait, the way her grandmother had, on the last day of the season that had ended so badly. Taught him without ever meeting him to wear it now. When she had finished, the stable clock struck the hour. Neither of them moved. In the courtyard below, a groom called to a boy about a lame horse, and the boy answered, and the horse, being a horse, declined to comment. She heard herself smile, very slightly, at the horse's discretion. He heard her smile, and he turned his head and he said, quite softly, "I have been afraid of you since the day we married." She said, "I know." He said, "I would like to stop." She said, "Then stop." He said, "It will take longer than an afternoon." She said, "We have longer than an afternoon." He said, "We do." They sat. The light went out of the gallery slowly, portrait by portrait, until only the small one at the end still held a little of it, and even that faded, and the woman in the frame kept her ring turned inward in the dark, patient as she had been patient for 41 years, waiting to be understood. At supper, that night, the household noticed 3 things, and pretended to notice none of them. The mistress wore green, and a silver locket at her throat, and no ring on her hand. The master wore, on the smallest finger of his right hand, a plain gold band that no one at the table recognized, and no one asked about. And when, at the second course, the dowager remarked, in the tone she reserved for observations that were meant as blades, that green was a bold choice for a woman in her position, the master, without lifting his eyes from his plate, said mildly, "My wife's position is precisely the one she has chosen, and I find the color suits it." The dowager set down her fork. She did not lift it again for the remainder of the meal. Down the long table, the chaplain, who had been present at the wedding and had privately doubted every word of it, permitted himself a small, dry cough of a kind that was not, strictly speaking, either approving or disapproving, but that would be remembered later by every servant in the room as the sound of a house changing its mind about itself. Afterward, when the ladies had withdrawn and the gentlemen had not yet been called for, the master went to the west study alone. He locked the door, he lit 1 candle, he took the ring from his smallest finger, and he turned it inward, and he held it to the candle, and he read, for the second time that day, the 3 small marks his great-aunt had ordered cut into the band by a jeweler in a city she had never been permitted to return to. He read them slowly. He read them until his hand, for the second time that day, began to shake, and this time he let it. In the yellow sitting room, at the same hour, his wife took the treatise on inheritance law from the writing table, and she carried it to the fire. And she did not burn it, because she was not, and had never been, a woman who burned evidence. She placed it, instead, on the small round table beside her chair, open to page 142, and she rang for tea, and she waited. Quite calmly, for her husband to find her, which he did, at 10 minutes past the hour, without knocking. He sat down in the chair opposite. He did not speak. She poured. He accepted the cup. They drank their tea in a silence that was, for the first time in 11 months, not a silence of strategy, but a silence of company, and outside the tall windows the park went dark, and the lime trees at the edge of it stood in their long, patient row, and somewhere among their roots, in a small tin box buried 41 years ago by a young woman who had been sent home in disgrace. A second copy of the 3 lines waited, unbothered, to be dug up when the time was right, which would not be tonight, and would not be tomorrow, and would be, they had agreed without saying so, on a morning in the spring, when the ground was soft and the household was at prayer and no one would think to ask why the master and mistress had gone out walking, arm in arm, toward the trees, and that, my dear listener by the fire, is where I will leave them for tonight, sitting quietly together over a cooling pot of tea, in a room where, for the first time in 11 months, no one is pretending. If you have ever handed something precious to a person who did not yet understand its weight, and watched their hand shake when the weight arrived, then you know what she felt when his fingers closed on the ring, and you know why she chose green for supper, and you know why she did not. When the moment came, hurry him. Tell me, if you would, which line of theirs stayed with you longest. Was it certainly, said without a tremor? Was it, I have been afraid of you since the day we married? Was it, we have longer than an afternoon? Or was it the small, dry courtesy of the horse in the courtyard, declining to comment on matters above its station? Whichever it was, carry it with you into the quiet part of your evening. And if you would like to sit by this fire again for the next story, and the one after that, then draw your chair a little closer and stay. There is always another log, and there is always another tale, and there is always a place kept for you here, whenever you have the time to listen. Sleep well, friend. I will see you by the fire.